time of our guest speakers, so we will go ahead and get started. First of all, good evening, everyone, and welcome to our Housing Advocacy panel, which will take a look at who is helping to shape Colorado's housing policies. My name is Trish Warner, and I'm a member of the League of Women Voters, Larimer County, and also a member of the state-level housing task force that's been in existence for about 3 years. The Housing Task Force purpose is to inform and engage members across the state to promote collective actions around housing issues as they are aligned with the league position that does state that it is the responsibility of all levels of government to provide equality of opportunity for education, employment, and housing for all persons in the U.S. regardless of race, color, gender, religion, national origin, age, sexual orientation, or disability. There is a close connection to the housing work done with the League's Legislative Action Committee. And our Legislative Action Committee is made up of Kate Van Houten, Joe Federer, Kathy Smith, and Andrea Wilkins, who is the League liaison to our legislature. So I'm going to hand off to Maud. I believe she is here to speak a little bit more about this Legislative Action Committee. So Maud, I'm going to let you take it away.
I'm sorry, I don't think Maud's here yet. Andrea, would you be so kind as to do that?
Yes, I'd be happy to.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you for the context around the LAC, Trish, and a little bit of information about us. Trish mentioned the Housing Issue Area Task Force team that is part of our Legislative Action Committee, and they have been a really dedicated group in following legislative activity around the affordable housing arena, homelessness, land use, all sorts of things, and have really just been an asset to our advocacy efforts. To give you a little bit of context about the group more broadly, the Legislative Action Committee, or the LAC as we refer to them for short, is our citizen lobbying corps, who the group is currently made up of about 35 individuals, I think we're standing at right now, that lobby the General Assembly on a whole host of areas in addition to housing related legislation, things that really kind of run the gamut from government, elections and voting, a variety of social policy issues, and a number of natural resources and environmental related policy issues. So we have a really strong group of citizen lobbyists who have just got some deep expertise in a range of issues. And our goal is really to further our organizational positions. And where housing is concerned, the League believes that everyone should have access to adequate and affordable housing. We have long been concerned about the affordability crisis in Colorado. So we've been thrilled at the work that is taking place within the General Assembly and within the stakeholder community, and the fact that this has just really been a priority for the General Assembly for the last few years. We know there's a lot more work to be done, and we're really excited that our issue area team is plugged into this issue, and that you all have been assembled here, or our speakers have been assembled here tonight, and all of you are joining us to listen in, because we do expect a lot of activity in this area again during the coming 2025 session, and the League stands ready to really assist with that effort and hopefully push things forward to help continue to make a dent in the housing crisis that we're experiencing in Colorado. So a big thank you to Kathy, Trish, and the rest of the housing team for putting this together, and a big thank you to our presenters tonight. We are thrilled to hear from you. And with that, I'll turn it back to Trish.
Great. Thank you, Andrea, for that overview of the work that goes on. So I'm going to pass the baton on to Kathy Smith, who will introduce our panel.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here tonight. We're excited to have this panel and to really get an idea of some of the organizations and folks that are helping to change the housing legislation that's been so important and continues to be important. I'm Kathy Smith. I'm part of the Jeffco League and a member of the LAC. And I put a few links in the chat about the Legislative Action Committee, the LAC, the State Housing Task Force that's putting this on, and also just the general website for the League of Women Voters. So how we're going to do this tonight is to have some introductions of our four panelists that are working to shape policy and very involved in some of the bills for the statewide legislation that's going to happen next year. And we'll hear from each of them, and they'll tell us a little bit about their organizations. And then we'll move on, and each will discuss a bill that they're involved with for the next session. And after each brief presentation, we'll have some questions specific for that particular bill to clarify any questions you have. And then after all four bills have been presented, we'll have kind of an open discussion with questions and answers and anything that you want to discuss. And we'll wrap up by 8:30. So first up, I would like to introduce Zach Martinez, who's with the Gary Community Ventures. He's the Director of Policy and Advocacy and Legal Counsel at Gary, with experience in working in government, nonprofit, and for-profit organizations. Since joining the team, he has advised on many of Gary's key priorities, including the passage of Proposition 123, which is a statewide ballot measure devoted to the creation of affordable housing, and the passage of the Family Affordability Tax Credit, which is the largest child tax credit in the country. Zach was born and raised in Grand Junction, but now calls Denver home, and he'll give us a brief overview about Gary and what they do. Take it away.
Thank you. Yeah, that was great. I think that bio just summarized the whole thing. But Gary Community Ventures is a private foundation and advocacy organization combined in two, with kind of a complicated legal structure, but that's the most important thing. And I work on our family economic mobility policy, which encompasses affordable housing, but also public benefits reform, tax credits, workforce development, things like that. I describe it kind of as anything that can either increase the income or decrease the costs for families in Colorado. Gary Community Ventures has existed in Colorado since the 1970s, where we've been involved in the passage of a lot of statewide policy, but most recently Proposition 123 and the Family Affordability Tax Credit. One of our other big areas of focus is in early childhood. So we've been very involved in the K-12 space and the passage of Proposition EE, which created universal preschool in Colorado. But we've been very focused on affordable housing, mostly with Proposition 123, to make sure that we have adequate funding, or at least a whole lot more funding for affordable housing, trying to address the affordability crisis. Yeah, happy to answer any questions about Gary.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Zach. And if folks have questions as we go along, feel free to put them in the chat, and perhaps the panelists can answer them directly, or we can include them in the Q&A periods. Next up, we have Kinsey Hasstedt, who is with Enterprise Community Partners in the Denver office. She's the Director for State and Local Policy. In this role, Kinsey crafts and oversees Enterprise's policy agenda and advocacy to increase the supply of affordable homes and advance housing stability in Denver and throughout Colorado. And they focus on individuals and families living on low or fixed incomes. She collaborates with state and local elected officials and policymakers, implementing agencies and partners, including affordable housing developers, legal aid, and rental assistance providers, and also community-based organizations. And Kinsey's going to give us a brief description of what Enterprise Community Partners does, and she also oversees a statewide affordable housing, and I guess federal now, affordable housing policy table. So she may be able to tell us a little bit about that too. Kinsey, take it away.
Thank you, Kathy. I came just in the nick of time. It's lovely to see you all. It's nice to see some friends and faces of folks who come to our monthly affordable state and federal policy table. My name, as Kathy shared, is Kinsey. I am the Director of State and Local Policy for Enterprise Community Partners. We do not do rental cars. It feels like a very important disclaimer up front. That's what a lot of people assume. We do, in fact, work on affordable housing across the country. So Enterprise is a nationwide organization seeking to increase the supply of and people's access to high quality homes, particularly rental homes, and particularly those that are affordable to people living on low and fixed incomes. And Enterprise is a very big and very unwieldy organization. But it is that way because we seek to influence affordable housing in all kinds of ways. So we work across the country to increase the supply through capital investments. We have a very significant investment arm, and we are one of the largest syndicators of federal low-income housing tax credits in the country. Enterprise also has a very large CDFI, or nonprofit community bank. We are one of the biggest ones of those in the country, giving out loans, particularly for the production and preservation of affordable housing. Here in the Denver metro area, our CDFI, our loan fund, administers the Transit Oriented Development Fund, which is focused on preserving and creating homes and communities along transit. We've done that for a long time. And then in addition to the capital side, we seek to really work in policies and in programs. So in places where we have a presence across the country, we try to become very ingrained in and supportive of our community-based partners and in very specific neighborhoods. Here in Colorado, for instance, we work really hard to support our partners in both East and West Colfax, for those who know those areas of Denver. And we have also worked to advise and support communities, local governments across the state in their creation of new affordable housing. And then on the policy side, which is where I sit, we seek to influence policy at all levels of government. So I have very smart and capable colleagues who are out in Washington, D.C., working at the federal policy level. And then in the areas where Enterprise has a presence, which is in about a dozen different cities or states across the country, there are state and local policy directors looking to influence policy at those state and local government levels. And I am the one working in Colorado and Denver. So, and as Kathy mentioned, I'm lucky enough to facilitate a monthly convening of groups that are advocating for affordable housing and housing stability policy at the state level. And we recently joined efforts with a table that our friends from CCH were facilitating on federal policy. So many of your colleagues here, if you haven't joined us in those meetings, represent you all very well, but we're always pleased to have others. So thank you.
Thank you, Kinsey. Next up is Aubrey Wilde with the Colorado Coalition for the Homeless, CCH. Aubrey is the Advocacy Program Director, and she specializes in governmental affairs. She has a breadth of experience in Colorado's nonprofit sector, previously working with the Colorado Center on Law and Policy and the National Conference of State Legislators, and the Rocky Mountain Community Land Trust. She graduated from Colorado College with a bachelor's degree in sociology and earned a master's in public administration with a concentration in hazards, disasters, and emergency management from University of Colorado, Denver. Aubrey is committed to making Colorado an even better place to live by advocating for effective public policy and creating connection. In her free time, she loves to mountain bike and spend time with her wife, Nikki, and cat, Bruce. And she'll tell us a bit about the Colorado Coalition for the Homeless. take it away, Aubrey.
All right, thank you, Kathy. It's great to be here with everyone tonight. For those of you who aren't familiar with the coalition, we have been around for about 40 years, and we have developed a little bit like a Dr. Seuss house in those years. Initially, folks wanted to end homelessness in Denver within 5 years through clinical services. And of course, that ultimately didn't end up happening. And the leaders of the organization realized that we need to respond to homelessness in a really robust and multifaceted way. So since then, we've grown to about 850 employees, and we largely focus on housing, specifically affordable and permanent supportive housing. We do that through apartment buildings that we own and operate, and through partnerships with community landlords, and through vouchers that we administer. And we also do this through integrated healthcare. We have 5 healthcare centers, mostly in the Denver metro area. We also have a campus down in Los Animas, Colorado. And then we also have a robust suite of supportive services that help people get housed and stay housed successfully, like behavioral health treatment and case management, money management, anything you can imagine that helps people on their path to stability, whatever that might look like. In total, we serve about 20,000 folks every year. And Andrew and I are part of our small but mighty education and advocacy team that handles governmental affairs, and internal communications and external communications. So Andrew and I are part of that policy side of the shop. And like Kinsey, we operate at all levels of government with our policy work. And we split that work into 4 main buckets: housing, homelessness, healthcare, and economic justice. As you can imagine, that touches just about everything. At the state level, we end up tracking about a quarter of the bills that move through the legislative process, and engaging on about 30 to 45 pieces of legislation each year. So really excited to talk to you a little bit about what we're focusing on this year.
Thanks, Aubrey. And finally, we have Andrew West, who is also with the Colorado Coalition for the Homeless. He is a policy associate where he has spent the last 2.5 years advocating for policies that prevent and resolve homelessness. Before coming to the coalition, Andrew received his bachelor's degree in political science from Colorado College, where he focused on international relations and also ran cross country and track and field. And Andrew is partnering with the Colorado Poverty Law Project on a bill, and we'll be talking about the Colorado Poverty Law Project a little bit, describing that organization.
Yeah.
Take it away, Andrew.
Sure. Thank you, Kathy, and thank you all for joining tonight. I appreciate you all taking some time out of your evening to come listen to what we're working on in terms of legislative solutions to housing and affordable housing. Yeah, I work along Aubrey. I work with Aubrey alongside at the Colorado Coalition for the Homeless. We work on policy stuff. I cover some of our federal policy agenda as well. I also help out with projects including voter registration. We're involved with the Denver Basic Income Project and other one-time projects as well. Since Aubrey gave such a great overview of the work we do at CCH, I'll offer a bit on what the Colorado Poverty Law Project does, or CPLP. I don't work there, so this is a shameless plug and a shout out to our partners who we're working with. And I'll mention that we're working very closely with Jack Regenbogen and Ariane Frosch on drafting legislation. I'm seeing some head nods. I know everyone knows Jack. CPLP's mission is to prevent homelessness through free legal assistance, housing navigation, and advocacy. They have a team of about 20 staff members who work statewide to assist people with housing issues and providing free legal defense. They have intake available online in English and Spanish, and any help that they provide to people is available free of charge. They connect low-income individuals with free legal services in some of the hardest cases through weekly Denver court clinics, and allow people to chat with an attorney weekly, and that's available to all different people with all different sorts of cases. They also provide housing navigation services to help people seek new housing arrangements with community housing navigators who assist them through that process that can oftentimes be pretty complex to find a new place to live. And as many of you might also know, they do housing advocacy at the legislative at the state level, working on legislative issues and policy agendas that protect tenants, including laws that keep Coloradans in safe and stable housing, give tenants the resources to fight eviction, and prevent discrimination and other predatory practices. A couple bills they've worked on last year that some of you might remember if you've been involved with housing for a while. Our Senate Bill 94, which strengthened Colorado's warranty of habitability and overhauled standards and processes for a renter to obtain rights in their unit and have safe and healthy housing. They also worked on House Bill 1099, which eliminated the answer filing fee. That's a bill that we worked on as well. And they also have done a lot of work to reform Colorado's Mobile Home Park Act. So that's an overview on CPLP. And Jack mentioned that if there are any questions, please let me know and I'll be happy to forward them over to him. So thank you for having me tonight.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you, everyone. We're now going to go into the second part, which is describing the legislation. So going to get a brief description of a piece of legislation and then a brief Q&A about that particular legislation that we'll open up. Please do feel free to put questions into the chat as they come up, and the panelists feel free to answer them, or we can answer them in real time during the discussion period. And I should mention that, the neat thing about a lot of these organizations and folks are that they bring an enormous amount of expertise and also boots on the ground information to the legislature. These are folks who actually know where the problems are and bring the issues to the legislature and then advocate for it. So, and they're always there at the hearings, providing expert testimony, and it's really a great group of people who coordinate very well together. And these are just a few, but some of the best that we see at the legislature. So just wanted to give them a kudos and thank you for your work, and looking forward to watching your continuing work. So first up on the bill discussions is going to be Zach Martinez. And he's going to be talking about a bill about empowering faith and education institutions to build housing.
Thank you so much. That was very kind. Thank you, Kathy. Yeah, so our bill is formally called Empowering Faith and Education Institutions to Create the Housing Their Communities Need. It's also known as YIGB, which is not a better title, but stands for Yes in God's Backyard. Which is a type of legislation that has been passed in other communities, that in other states, that has empowered religious organizations to build affordable housing on their own land. Specifically in our bill, it's actually going to create additional abilities for faith-based organizations, but also school districts and public universities to build on their own land. And it will the reason why we're focusing on these types of organizations is because they have very close connections to the communities that they're in. They have mission alignment, for looking for building the type of housing that they know those communities need. And then also they have a plethora of available and underutilized land. Churches have a lot of land, both in parking lots and also just undeveloped land that is less noticeable sometimes. And then, of course, school districts, which are the largest landowners in most of our communities other than the state. These organizations also have unique issues that they're trying to solve. We know that only 20% of for sale housing is affordable to a teacher making the median salary in their district. So there's a acute need for both the retention of teachers and for bringing in new teachers to have housing that their salaries can actually support. So what this bill actually does is it right sizes the review process to create a more predictable process for the development of housing on school and faith-based land. What that means is it basically just creates a streamlined process for if a district or faith-based organization needs to rezone their land, get different oh my gosh, I just spaced the word. Um, yeah, to basically all of the process the developer has to go through in order to develop on their land, it will allow them to do so without going through a process that in some communities can take over 2 years. A couple things to keep in mind is, there you go, that's a, thank you, Kev, or Kinsey, oh my gosh. A couple things to keep in mind is that this bill isn't going to have any financial resources behind it. And that's important for a couple of reasons. One is it makes it really hard to put front end affordability restrictions on the land that would actually be developed in order to get this use by right. But once a church or education institution does decide to develop on their land, most of them will likely then go through a process to try to actually attain additional state subsidies. Those state subsidies will then require them to build affordably, which is great. The other key thing to keep in mind is that all of the housing that's built in these properties will be subject to the Fair Housing Act and state tenant protection laws, which is very important, as Colorado has been a leader in this space over the last few years. And then the other item to keep in mind is that local communities will still be able to require certain items related to health and safety. So it's a little bit of a technical bill, but our hope is to kind of get rid of some of the red tape and make it easier for these types of organizations to build housing that they know their communities need.
Zach, I see a question in chat for you specifically. Can you see that?
Oh, yes, I can. Would you like me to answer it?
Sure.
Will the bill address property tax exemptions for housing activity? I think we just had a conversation with the assessor's office around property taxes. And the answer to that is we're still figuring out exactly how those will interact with each other.
Also, will the proposed bill help with rentals for teachers?
The answer is yes, that is part of the goal of the bill, is to create opportunities for building of rental units as well.
And there's one from Julie. I wonder, Julie, if you might want to ask the question verbally. Not sure I quite understand it.
Yeah, thank you. So, Zach, I guess I'm coming from a Fort Collins perspective, and we've seen a couple of developments on faith-based land and, normal community issues, as you would expect. We see them all the time, dense housing next to single family, so nothing there, but it seems to have gone pretty well. So I'm trying to get a sense of this issue of zoning and projects getting done. Is this a significant statewide issue, or is it centered in certain communities?
That's a super good question, and I guess I should have mentioned one of our bill sponsors is Rep. Snecker. So from your community, with he oftentimes brings up some of the very successful developments that you guys have had up there. The issue is it definitely exists. I can tell you that. What most of the projects that end up getting developed, and I'm more deeply knowledged in some of the education developments that have gone through, tend to be the developments that actually have the simplest process here. So either they're on land that doesn't currently have a school or doesn't currently have a church, or we're already zoned properly for residential development, which I think that in itself is a good example of, because the things that are actually getting to the finish line didn't have this as a problem, is a sign that, maybe if we could make it so less pieces of land have this problem, then they would be better off. One of the major issues that we know exists is around, it's very technical, but it's about basically most pieces of land have, one primary use. So if it's being used for something else, say a church, then it's possible that even if it is in a residential space, they wouldn't be able to build residential on that property. So we want to make sure that that's no longer an issue.
There's a couple others, Zach, and then we'll go on from there, if you don't mind. Can you see the chat? Or I can
That's
read them.
from Mindy. How will you deal with the pushback from cities and counties screaming about local control? Always a good question. And I think the answer is just like to have the conversations. I think we're really trying to, we have a bill draft, and that bill draft has a lot of open questions that I think we are trying to solve through partnership with the local governments to say, well, what is the right way to do this? I think Representative Basenecker is really good at being clear that we don't think that that this problem of housing affordability is just the fault of or the problem of local governments, but we do think that the status quo doesn't work. And so we need to do something to address the status quo, and this is one way to do it. But we're hoping it'll be a great conversation where we'll be able to find solutions together.
And another from Megan, the intent of the bill is just any kind of residential development, or is it limited by underlying zoning?
So it will be residential development. We're having one of the questions actually that we have not answered in the bill draft, but we'll be having conversations with local government and other stakeholders on, is what is the level of density that we should allow on these pieces of land. We feel really convicted that the bill should have be impact the entire state. Which means that there's, it's a complicated conversation around density, because what's right in a rural community isn't necessarily the right solution for urban. So hopefully that's helpful. We're still figuring it out.
And I think I'll let Gaithia ask her question verbally, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so my concern, the big analogy I would use is what's happened with hospitals and the Catholic Church, where they have had a big tax exemption and now have driven, in many markets, there's no alternative to the Catholic hospital. And the Catholic hospital operates as in a way that Catholics and not everybody feels comfortable with. And in the terms of land development, big mega churches are able to purchase what otherwise would be agricultural land to build churches. And I know that has been a big issue here in Boulder County, where people are interested in preserving open space. And so I think that you could see, I mean, a lot of churches, let's face it, they're big business operations. So you can see the sweet examples, that the ones that seem, well, sure, there's 2 churches here in Longmont where I live that have turned part of their parking lot into housing. And they both happen to be fairly open-minded churches, and so probably accepting of whoever moves into those apartments, but that's not true of everybody that moves into God's backyard. So I'm really concerned that this actually will create a system of people taking advantage of the ability to go into land otherwise zoned protectively and break those zoning protections. And it becomes essentially equivalent to big business in a way that's very biased.
Yeah, that's very fair. I think that that is part of why we reiterate in the bill that any housing built through this process will still be subject to the Fair Housing Act. We want to make sure that obviously that churches who are building housing and getting help through this aren't going to build housing and then say they're only going to house their the people who agree with them on their religious beliefs. So I definitely hear you there. And at the same time, like, we need housing, and the churches and just have a lot of land, and land is one of the the things that we're most in short supply of here in Colorado, especially in our more urban communities. So if we're able to unlock the land to build more housing, we want to find ways to do it.
Well, I think there's a big difference between saying that you're unbiased and what you mean by that. And the example I'll just bring in is my sister-in-law, who told her gay grandson in the middle of a Thanksgiving dinner that he was going to hell, but then said, please pass potatoes or whatever. And in her mind, she loves him very much. I mean, she does, but she's not going to resist saying that. I don't think everybody wants to live in God's backyard. And I don't think the godly people are necessarily entirely as open-minded as, I think it would be a very difficult situation in many circumstances.
There are fair housing laws that would still apply, right?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
So I'd like to move on from here. There's going to be at the end of the 4 bills more opportunity for open discussion. So maybe we can continue some discussion about this bill then, if that's okay, and move on to the next bill. So Kinsey Hasstedt is going to talk about homelessness infrastructure and housing funding.
Okay. So Enterprise is very pleased and excited to be working with our partners at the Coalition for the Homeless on this bill. It is seeking to do a number of things around homelessness and housing, divided into 4 main buckets. And the first 3 are going to sound a lot alike, and the 4th one is a little bit different, but they're all working toward the same aim, I promise. So the first provision of this bill on homelessness infrastructure would be to establish a statutory permission for local governments who have a similar approach to homelessness and who similarly want to help solve homelessness to create a special regional district to address homelessness together. And they would be able to do so with a taxing authority. So the analogy to this is that currently throughout the state, local governments in Colorado can create a regional housing authority if they so choose. So folks probably know the Denver Housing Authority, and different municipal governments or counties can have their own individual housing authorities. But there are a small handful of regional housing authorities throughout the state, which is a permission we recently learned was established back in the 70s. When it just makes sense for local governments to affiliate with each other for this purpose of seeking to, in the case of a housing authority, house folks who are living on low incomes. In the case of what is being contemplated in this bill, local governments coming together to seek to prevent and resolve homelessness. So that's provision number 1. The second provision would formalize Colorado's Interagency Council on Homelessness as directed by the governor's office. So there is currently an Interagency Council on Homelessness. It largely comprises agency directors. So it's not legislators, it's not community, it's those who are directing agencies throughout the state who have some sort of role in responding to homelessness or helping to prevent it. And the proposal in this bill would seek to codify that and formalize it so that it wouldn't go away with the transition of gubernatorial leadership. Folks may have seen, I think I saw in the news a couple of weeks ago, that President-elect Trump would have, for instance, no interest in continuing the National Interagency on Homelessness, Interagency Council on Homelessness. This body would be looking also at best practices and kind of setting a statewide collaborative and holistic strategy for homelessness resolution and prevention throughout Colorado. The third provision would direct the Office of Homelessness Initiatives, or OHI, which lives in the Department of Local Affairs. So it directs the Office of Homelessness Initiatives to play a really proactive coordinating role among all of the entities and agencies seeking to address homelessness who aren't the state agencies in the state. So directing this office to coordinate the 4 continuum of care organizations throughout the state, of which Colorado Coalition for the Homeless is one, to coordinate newly formed homelessness navigation centers. Folks probably have seen and will continue to see a lot in the news about Ridgeway and other large campuses that are being funded and coming together to seek to respond to homelessness. And this office would then, with all of this coordination, be required to annually report to the legislature on progress and how things are going. So all three of those first provisions are really focused on kind of creating that enduring, coordinated homelessness infrastructure, with the aim of kind of creating a statewide strategy and having all the people who are responsible for serving these folks talking to each other, and some form of accountability in those reports to the legislature. The fourth piece is the one that doesn't sound like the others, but we are always interested in trying to create new means of public revenue for truly affordable housing and for homelessness resolution and serving folks who need permanent supportive housing. You all are very well aware, I'm sure, that this year is going to be a totally crap budget year. There is no money. The state is $1 billion in the hole. So we are not, too Pollyanna pie in the sky. We are not looking for hundreds of millions of extra dollars this year. But what we are trying to do is take a tiny little step in a place that we've identified as a possibility for local governments to potentially use some of the funds coming into their own coffers to address affordable housing and homelessness. And this is through the documentary fee that is collected by county clerks and recorders. Whenever a document is filed at the county clerk level, most often this happens with real estate transactions. The provision of the bill would enable local governments to choose to use some portion of that documentary fee to fund affordable housing and homelessness prevention and resolution in their own communities. Currently, there is no statutory direction for how local governments have to use that documentary fee. It's expected that it's a fee, and so the revenue goes toward the county clerk and recorder covering its own costs of operations for maintaining property records. One of the things we are frankly working to understand is how much that brings in and how much additional revenue there might be over the cost of administering these programs. But we see this as one, tiny step forward in enabling local governments to use one of their own revenue streams toward affordable housing and homelessness. So those are the four very high level provisions of the bill. It is being run by Representative Routenell. We know this will be coming early in the session for him, and I would be happy to take anybody's questions. I can't talk and look at the chat at the same time, so if people ask something, I don't know what you asked.
Does anybody have a question for Kinsey?
The bill Zach talked about is just so much sexier than mine. I don't know.
I'm curious. I'm curious why you've lumped all these things under one bill. What the thought process was about that.
The three that sound alike and the one that doesn't, you mean?
Yeah.
That's a real fair question. I think, frankly, it's a process of legislators only have so many bill titles, and there's only so much that we can accomplish in any given legislative cycle. And by including, I think there is a real recognition that many communities in this state continue to face serious challenges in homelessness and homelessness resolution. And one of those main problems is money, right? And so even as the bulk of this bill seeks to increase coordination, increase statewide accountability and transparency on how homelessness is being addressed, we also need more money to do that. And it's unrealistic to expect anything to come from the state this year, really. And so this is a means for local governments to access that. And we and CCH and many of our partners really do strongly believe that it doesn't make a lot of sense to restrict buckets of public money to very specific uses. And so in trying to expand the universe of public funding out there, we would want it to be local governments to be able to use it both for homelessness resolution as well as affordable housing. And I think there's the reality that this is a way that we could try to advance all of these policies.
So Kinsey, I have a question. I'm sitting here thinking about the continuum of care structures that currently exist, like up here in Larimer County, we've got the Northern Colorado Continuum of Care. So would that structure have any role in this regional service to be provided to the homeless, or is it another type of a structure that would be created parallel to those continuums?
It would be another, the bill would create the opportunity for another kind of structure to be created. I think the intent is certainly not to step on continuum of care organizations' toes. You know, COCs are mentioned in the fact that OHI would be coordinating them better and hopefully, you know, moving things together all at once. I think the permission for local governments who so choose to come together in kind of a regional homelessness authority is not intended to step on a COC's toes. I would hope that if that happened in a place like Northern Colorado, that there would be considerable discussion and conversation as to how to make them work together. But the permission granted in this bill would not seek to usurp the COC authority or capacity. And if Andrew or Aubrey know any differently, please chime in. But I think the intent is that they would work alongside each other, and not one taking over the other.
There's another question in the chat here from Mindy asking, where do the documentary fees go now?
Great question. So, you know, it is expected that a fee be used to cover the cost of administering whatever the fee is being charged for. So we believe and know that the fees are going toward county clerks and recorders to cover their costs of administering the programs wherein they accept documents and file them and respond, again, particularly to all these real estate transactions. But one of the things that we are asking clerks and recorders right now is how much, if they find that the doc fees that they are bringing in fact cover their costs, if they have additional revenue from the doc fees and where are they going. And so we both know that they are going to cover actual costs, and we are in kind of an inquisitive mode of trying to understand better what the reality is on the ground, even as we try to grant this flexibility. If you know any differently, please tell me.
Okay, great. Thank you, Kinsey. And we can pick up questions in the general discussion later too. Anything comes up, or feel free to put something in the chat that Kinsey could respond to directly. Next up is Aubrey Wilde, and she's going to be talking about strengthening the Colorado Necessary Documents program. Aubrey.
Thank you, Kathy. So yes, we are working on a bill to strengthen the Colorado Necessary Documents program. We are working closely with Colorado Center on Law and Policy, Violence Free Colorado, Blueprint to End Hunger, and Homeward Alliance. And I'm so excited to see my friend Serena Thomas here from Homeward Alliance on the call. She's actually the one who brought this issue and this idea to us as something that we might want to work on the legislative level. I think this bill provides a really good example of that broad statewide coalition work that has gotten us to this point where we have a bill that we're really proud of. So for those who aren't familiar with it, the Colorado Necessary Documents Program, also sometimes referred to as the Colorado ID Project, pays for vouchers for free identification documents, including driver's licenses, state ID cards, and birth certificates, mostly, for residents who are victims of domestic violence, impacted by natural disaster, and maybe all of their documents and belongings were lost in that disaster, low income, disabled, or experiencing homelessness. Of course, an ID is required for just about everything you can imagine, including opening a bank account, cashing a check, driving legally, complying with law enforcement requests for documentation so you can stay out of the criminal legal system. This is particularly important for people experiencing homelessness, accessing healthcare, housing, employment, and public benefits like SNAP, food assistance. So it's really important. This is a really intersectional issue. Of course, housing is kind of the nexus for us tonight. ID is required for both subsidized and non-subsidized housing, even at the coalition. So this is something that's really crucial, particularly for the most vulnerable individuals. And this program has been operating since 2006. It was first developed by the nonprofit and philanthropy communities, and then in 2016, it was incorporated into statute. And it is in 2021, there was a bill that was passed to make this a permanent program, so it doesn't have a sunset anymore, so it will continue. But we are trying to make a few changes to it because we've found that for those who can access this program, it's incredibly useful and valuable. But for those who can't, there are really significant barriers. Just a few of those barriers are that there's not enough money in the program. It's been funded at $300,000 for years. And organizations like Homeward Alliance have crunched the numbers, and they found that this funding meets about 10% of the need. It also is not really distributed fairly across the state, so some people are left out entirely. The administration of the program is also incredibly complicated, and it leads to inefficiencies, breakdowns in communication between the state, the administering organization, participating nonprofits, and the beneficiaries of the program. The money transfers hands about 4 times before it actually gets to the humans that can use it. So we'd like to streamline things a little bit. And then finally, there's a 30% redemption rate of these paper vouchers. These paper vouchers have to be cut out by hand, handed to these participating nonprofits, and then those have to be handed to the individuals who meet the criteria and can use them, and they expire within 30 days. And for a lot of these populations that benefit from the program, hanging on to paperwork or documentation can be really challenging, which is why a lot of them might be in this situation to begin with. So hanging on to that voucher and utilizing that within 30 days, particularly when there's often a 6-week wait time to get into the DMV for an ID, is just unrealistic. So very, very low redemption rate based on the current program structure. So what are the solutions? We've got 3 goals with this bill. First is to transition to a voucherless program model. Under this model, people would be able to access IDs at the point of contact, either brick and mortar, a mobile unit, or virtual access points. And they can self-attest to their eligibility within one of these categories. Second, we want to expand the program to increase geographic equity. There are only a couple dozen participating organizations. So if a person needs an ID, but they're not connected with one of those couple dozen organizations that are largely concentrated on the Front Range, they're not going to be able to benefit from this program at all. It's also unfortunate that only 35 DMVs participate, only state-operated DMVs, so that leaves out a lot of Colorado counties. Also, only 2 vital statistics offices participate and honor the program. So you can only get your birth certificate at 2 locations here in the Denver metro area. So we want to make sure that all of the offices that provide these crucial documents are participating. And third, we want to grow funding for the program. We know this is a difficult budget year, to borrow Kinsey's words. It's a totally crap budget year. It's really the only way to put it. But we are still going to make a small ask that they double the current funding, adding an additional $300,000 per year. This is going to be challenging. I expect that number will go down as we move through the legislative process, but because this program is meeting so little of the need, we think it's still important to make that ask. But even if we aren't able to expand the funding for the program, that first goal will kind of is able to stand alone and will make a big difference in the infrastructure of the program. A couple just highlights that I want to mention in terms of timeline. The voucherless structure and statewide participation will take effect July 1st of 2027. So there is a pretty good ramp up period for participating or administering agencies to figure out this new structure and push out communications and education that might be needed. It also lines up with the Drives computer system update that the Department of Revenue is working on, which is kind of wonky, but they've asked that we hold off until 2027. And then it also lines up with the end of the state's contract with the current administering nonprofit that passes those vouchers through. I think, yeah, so looking forward, Senator Henriksen is the sponsor of this bill, and he is chosen this as a pre-file, meaning that it will be introduced in the first week of legislative session. So we're really excited to see this move forward. We feel really good about it. We've got a long list of supporters and would love to add you all to that list. And I'm happy to answer any questions.
There's one in the chat about the need for security and the cost of security. Can you read the chat, or should we have Gaithia?
Sure, yeah. So I see online ID databases need much greater security overall. Increasing access points makes this even more challenging. I think that the costs are much greater than covered here. So we do expect that there will be a fiscal note. Currently, and for the last several years, some portion of that $300,000 has gone to the departments for administration purposes. That will remain the same, but there will be an additional fiscal note for any computer changes that might need to happen. We are not increasing access points necessarily. We're just cutting out one step. So people will still be able to go to the DMV or go to vital statistics offices and access these documents. They just don't need to bring this little piece of paper with them saying that they are eligible. And there's also already kind of touch points online that people can use. And there are also already mobile units under the DMV that go to different locations to help connect people with IDs. So we're really not seeking to change that. We're just picking out one part. And then Andrew's done a lot of research on kind of the self-attestation model we're going for here. This is a best practice nationwide and for many different programs for particularly during the COVID emergency. A lot of that emergency funding that was pushed out and emergency access to Medicaid, for example, people use self-attestation to qualify for those things. So we've learned a lot from that experience in a lot of areas, and that's one of the lessons we're pulling from. And I see one question, is there a place for folks to store their documents that they could access later? That's a great idea and something that I would really love to talk about down the line. This bill doesn't touch that, but something that some places in Canada do is they have ID banks that are operated kind of in concert between a government agency and nonprofits. And I think that's a really smart thing to do. It can be really hard to hold on to IDs if you're experiencing homelessness. There was a student that did their capstone actually recently on some of the issues around getting IDs for people experiencing homelessness and getting swept in forced evictions from the street were a big reason people lost their IDs. Law enforcement just taking them was a big issue. Them getting stolen or lost just day to day were really huge. So I think, having some sort of place where people can safely store ID documents would be a great next step. And thank you, Kinsey, for your faith in my getting money out of crap budgets. We'll do our darndest.
There's one other one about how long the situation has been where getting necessary document has been this difficult.
Okay, and Serena, you might have some insight on that. I mean, at least since 2006 when the program was created, and I think we've just seen a greater and greater need since that, but I'm sure it's been a problem as long as time, and as long as there has been a need for identification documents.
And as Charlie pointed out in their capstone, this sort of the need for IDs in all these various situations became a bigger issue after 9/11 in 2001. So since then, various entities have been trying to address, so we need more secure documents, and then how do we do that? And so they pass this bill and that bill and this legislation, and then it becomes difficult and they change it. And so it's been going on for 25 years, at least.
Great insight, Serena. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Aubrey. And again, folks, feel free to put questions in the chat and we can pick them up at the discussion period a little later. Our final bill, Andrew West is going to talk about housing justice for victim survivors of gender-based violence. Andrew.
Thank you, Kathy. Thanks everyone for all the great questions and discussion today. Yeah, our bill is housing justice for victim survivors of gender-based violence. And this is an issue. We know that gender-based violence is a leading cause of statewide housing instability and homelessness. And at the Coalition for the Homeless and at the Colorado Poverty Law Project, we serve a lot of clients who are experiencing homelessness or facing eviction, who have had experiences with domestic violence or other forms of gender-based violence. The Metro Denver region's most recent continuum, in that continuum of care, the most recent point in time count showed that about 11% of people reported fleeing domestic violence and that immediately contributing to their experience of homelessness. And there are about 1,300 people statewide who reported being a victim survivor of domestic violence in 2023. So we know that there's a really clear connection between experiences of domestic violence and other forms of gender-based violence and homelessness. I'll also add that anecdotal data, both from CCH employees and CPLP staff, really corroborate the data. We hear from a lot of clients, especially women, that domestic violence is unfortunately all too common and leads to homelessness. So our aim with this bill is to both expand existing protections and create some new ones to improve housing stability, due process in court and access to justice, and safety for victim survivors. A quick note on nomenclature before I dive in. We choose to use the word victim survivors because on one hand, the word victim is associated with more a recently committed crime, but can also be associated with feelings of feeling powerless and helpless. While survivor tends to have a connotation that it is someone who's gone through the recovery process and perhaps has agency and feels empowered. But there are people who prefer one term or the other, so we choose to use victim survivors out of respect for people's preferences. And gender-based violence, domestic violence covers a lot of these cases, but it's not necessarily domestic if the people are not living in the same place, or intimate partner violence is also a term that's used, but because the two people might not know each other and might not be intimate partners, we choose a more broad language of gender-based violence. So that includes domestic violence, domestic abuse, unlawful sexual behavior, and stalking. So in the first bucket of housing stability, we're hoping to build on meaningful enforcement of legal protections that allow victim survivors to end their leases early. There was a 2017 bill titled Sex Assault and Stalking Victims May Break Leases, which allowed a tenant to break their lease and only be on the hook for 1 month's rent. While this is was a good law and allowed for a lot of people to get out of harmful situations and really dangerous situations, in practice, we're hearing that a lot of landlords routinely are going after more rent than the 1 month that a tenant is on the hook for. And there aren't very meaningful enforcement mechanisms around prohibiting a landlord from doing this. So the landlord would say, not following the notice for how a tenant is allowed to provide notice, saying I need a more formal notice or know that you're not allowed to do that, and going after 3, 4, 5 months rent when the tenant is only on the hook for 1. So we're hoping to establish some better enforcement, better clarity around the notice and what a landlord is required to demonstrate on their end to go after that 1 month's rent. In addition, we hope to protect a victim survivor's investment in a security deposit by ensuring that they aren't responsible for damages that might be caused by the responsible party or the abuser. If a tenant does terminate that lease, we want to clarify that they aren't responsible for any damages after they've moved out. So making sure that they are able to get their security deposit back even if they move out. And then lastly, we're hoping to expand from 10 days to 30 days the time for a victim survivor to move out and secure new housing following an eviction order. So even if they lose their case, they would be granted more time to find another place and make sure that that experience of eviction doesn't lead to homelessness. So that's the first bucket of housing stability. And I'll also note that all of these things sort of blend together. The second area around due process in court hopes to expand on a current law that allows for victim survivors to raise their experience with gender-based violence as a defense against their eviction. So that applies to a couple different areas of law around substantial evictions, material or repeat violations of of one's lease. But we know that the most common reason that people are evicted is because of non-payment cases. And what we're hearing a lot of times is that the abusive person or the responsible party can be the breadwinner, so that maybe that they're the one who's bringing income and they're the one who's paying the rent. And it can be hard to get out of an abusive situation when that person is also controlling a lot of the financial resources. We hope also to expand more clearly tie economic abuse and coercion to the current law. So we're hoping that in the case of a non-payment of rent, that we would allow a tenant to a repayment plan if they find that the reason for their non-payment was domestic violence, domestic abuse, or other forms of sexual violence. The next provision is hoping to expand the types of attestation to verify one's status to demonstrate that you are a victim survivor. And in doing this, we hope to align current state law with federal law. Some of you might be familiar with the Violence Against Women Act, or VAWA, which is a federal law that provides housing protections for people who live in units subsidized by the federal government. We hope both to add not new categories, but adding unlawful sexual behavior and stalking to the current protections of domestic violence and domestic abuse, but also allowing for a person to self-attest to their status or get a third-party verification letter. So this would allow someone to come to the Coalition for the Homeless and work with our victim survivor services team and get a letter saying, hey, I work closely with this person. I know that they are a victim of domestic violence. Currently, you're only allowed to submit a police report or a valid civil or emergency protection order. And we know that there can be some barriers in getting access to either of those two documents. Another thing that we've got a lot in this bill, we're touching on a lot of different things. But the next piece is that we're hoping to codify processes for victim survivors to access courts after a default judgment and extend court timelines when the delays are caused to experiences of gender-based violence. So perhaps the abuser is permitting someone from going to court and they would receive a default judgment. And we're hoping to have that cleared and allow an opportunity for someone to come back to court and state their case. The final prong of this bill, and this one's a bit shorter, but it guarantees the ability to have locks change when needed, along with other reasonable safety precautions, and ensuring that that isn't a violation of one's lease just for someone trying to stay safe in their own housing. And it would also require personal service of eviction notices, so making sure that those are hand delivered rather than slapping a notice on someone's door in a way that's really conspicuous and can lead to further abuse. And we're also hoping to suppress court records for evictions in the case that a defendant is a victim survivor. So I think that's about 8 or 9 things that we hope to cover through this bill. But we're feeling good that we can get a lot of these things through and really make some meaningful improvements to protections for victim survivors. So thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. Who's the prime sponsors on that?
We're working with Representative Mandy Lindsay. We're currently working on a draft. I don't know if we'll be introduced really early on in session, but we're anticipating this to be one of her earlier priority bills. So we're really excited about that.
Great. Anyone have a question for Andrew? I kind of have a question / comment that I'd be interested in what you have to say. Is we've had a lot of really important things pass the state legislature, especially for tenants' rights. And the trick has been to let the tenants know that they have these rights and for the landlords to know that they have these rights. And just wondering, there's an awful lot in this bill. Is there a plan to get the word out about how this works for people once, assuming it passes and becomes law? And how does one go about that?
Yeah, well, I appreciate the optimism. I think a lot of the education will come through the process of working on this bill, right? As we're working with organizations who are pretty closely involved with clients, what we're hoping that throughout the stakeholder process, making them aware and hoping to educate them through that process as well. Same thing with landlords. We'll be having conversation with landlords and making sure that they have information on how to follow the law should it change. I'll also add that we are hoping to include language in the summons. So when you're, which is a court document that you're served, that will say that due to this new law that has passed, if you are facing eviction for non-payment of rent, that you may be entitled to a repayment plan pursuant to the new law that has passed. And I think the last thing, although there are a lot of things included, I think the main things that a tenant or a defendant will need to know are that they are entitled to this repayment plan and that they have the option to break the lease and only be on the hook for 1 month's rent. So it's definitely implementation and education is very important. And I think a lot of legal aid providers and attorneys do a lot of great work in making sure that people know what rights are afforded to them.
Great.
Yeah, I was just going to add to Andrew's comments in that our partners like the Colorado Poverty Law Project and others who aren't here but are direct legal aid service providers, I know do a really good job as well of holding tenant education sessions and other opportunities for folks to learn their rights throughout the year and can augment as we pass new laws.
Yeah, great. This could be really important, I think. There's a question in the chat about what are the guardrails to avoid due process appeals? I guess it just actually came to me. What are the guardrails to avoid due process appeals is the question. And we can ask for clarification if we need it.
Yeah, that would be great if you could just clarify.
Joe, can you?
I'll also mention that
no,
I'm not an attorney.
I'm not at all opposed to anything that you're presenting, but you have to be concerned about whether or not this can hold up in a court appeal if there isn't some kind of due process, right? So if you're going to automatically provide, relief to somebody, whoever the offender is has a right to due process. So you have to concern yourself whether or not that opens up a lot more problem than we're anticipating.
Yeah, we definitely want to make sure that there is due process in this bill. I'll also add that just because a tenant raises that they are a victim survivor as an affirmative defense doesn't mean they'll necessarily win that case. It still has to go through the process, and a judge still would have to side with the defendant to determine whether the eviction was caused by an experience of domestic violence, assault.
Well, no, just all I'm saying is be aware that you're affecting two households, right? If you're talking about a domestic abuse, there are now two households. So make sure that we're not leaning too far in one direction or the other that might throw the whole issue into a legal question, right?
Yeah, definitely. That's definitely a fair concern and something that we are keeping in mind throughout this process.
Anyone else have a question for Andrew? If not, I think now we'll just open it up to a general discussion. So any of the bills or any general questions that folks have about housing policy and legislation, I think we'll see if we need to go through hand raising, but right now just speak up and or raise your hand and or put it in the chat, your questions.
Serena.
Hi. I had a question or comment for Kinsey. I actually had not heard of, is it Ridgeway? I had it pulled up here. Your Ridgey supportive residential. Oh, sorry, I was reading the chat. So So this sounds awesome. It's transitional housing that provides people with supportive services while they're looking for longer term. Is that right?
Yes, that's the intent. So I can put a link in the chat to a bill that was passed in 2022 addressing the Ridgeview campus. It is a campus that is currently vacant, have been used for educational purposes. When the state received a lot of money from ARPA, from the federal pandemic relief money, some of that money was allocated to repurposing this Ridgeview campus, specifically for a kind of homelessness services, supportive housing services, navigational site intended to serve a number of local communities. So it's also a big budget item this year. It's come back into the legislature this year. Lots of discussion on money to get it up and running. I know our partners at CCH are being tapped for their expertise in operating other similar campuses. So happy to put in the bill that kind of got this all started from a public funding standpoint. And no, there's tons of news stories out there on it, and it's going to come up much more in the coming legislative session as they debate funding and moving ahead with it.
Thank you.
And certainly welcome my colleagues at CCH to add more if they so choose. They're much more expert in this area than I am, but I think the hope is to have exactly the kind of services and another community base for that care as you described.
That was very thorough, Kinsey. I'll just add that CCH was selected to be the program partner and healthcare provider for Ridgeview. And this will look very similar to the program we currently operate in Los Animas, Colorado, called Fort Lyon Residential Recovery Community. So we do have some experience providing these types of service in this type of environment. And yeah, hopefully things move smoothly this legislative session.
Yeah, I encourage folks to look into those locations. They've had some great successes at both at Fort Lyon and hopefully in new locations that are coming online. So Celeste, do you want to ask your question verbally since it's long? I know it didn't get answered previously. I think it was for Zach.
Yes, it was for Zach. And as I understand the bill that Zach was describing, it just eases the regulatory process for building housing on school or faith-based land. But then after that, the success of building affordable housing is separate from that initial regulatory process. So how is there... I don't understand. Housing is not my area of expertise, and I don't know what kind of restrictions there are on affordable housing. I know company towns had some bad reputations, and so I wonder, are we in danger of creating a company town here for a school district, or can faith-based organizations restrict affordable housing to people who belong to their faith, etc.?
Yeah, it's a great question. So yes, the regulatory process is separate from obviously like making something affordable. We can't, it is really hard to put affordability restrictions onto the properties without any like actual financial subsidy, just because it's really hard to build housing right now. So what that means in practice is if we put affordability restrictions on the land without any financial subsidy, it would mean housing just wouldn't get built and the bill would be kind of useless. And then on your second question,
so
it's a little good.
Just now, I'm not a housing expert. I didn't understand all that terminology you were saying. So could you drop it down a notch?
Yeah. So right now it's really hard to build housing, right? That's part of why, there's not much affordable housing around. And really what is getting built right now is the housing that is getting some form of state, local, or federal subsidy, especially if it has any kind of affordability covenant on it. So this would ease regulatory restrictions on some type of housing, but because we won't have additional dollars to subsidize the actual rents and the actual building of the buildings, right now we're not putting affordability restrictions on the buildings that are being built. I think that's how I interpreted the first half of your question.
Okay.
The second half is around kind of the company towns. Churches would not be able to, at least by like the way we're writing the laws, they wouldn't be able to restrict the housing to just like their churchgoers. It would be able to be available to anyone. With school districts, it's a little bit more complicated. Schools already have the right to build teacher housing, and I'm not an expert in exactly how like every teacher housing environment in Colorado is handled if a teacher leaves the district or retires. So I guess what I'm saying is it's a little more complicated with the school districts, because what we don't want to do is run this bill and actually take rights away from the school districts, especially as they're trying to build teacher housing. And there's a lot of really great examples of districts stepping up to build affordable units for their teachers.
Thank you.
Yeah.
While we have Zach, there's another question about the YGB bill and how it would interact with issues of school funding and school closures. Has this been a topic of conversation?
Yeah, yes. So that's actually a huge part of why Gary Community Ventures, my organization, got engaged in this work, is we've been working with school districts around the Denver metro area on trying to create plans for school closures. Not necessarily about like the details of the school closures, but what do you do with infrastructure that you have that you continue to have to pay for out of your school district's funds, but aren't actually operating as schools. So our hope is that one thing that this will do is it will create an easier process for school districts to do really creative things with their land. So yeah, it absolutely will work together. The other thing that is a little separate from this is that districts are currently prohibited from renting out their land for more than 10 years, from a 10-year consecutive period. There's another bill that's happening to try to get rid of that restriction, to make it easier for districts to be able to, make money off of their land that they'll then be able to use. So great question. And yes, they do interact with each other.
I'm not sure, Kristen, I understand your question about the concern that this would divert funding from schools.
Hi, I can do my best to try to explain what I'm thinking and like some conversation I've heard. So thinking of like Amendment 80, for example, as like a way of moving funding away from public schools, and like knowing that so many of our schools can't afford to stay open 4 days a week right now, or 5 days a week. I guess I am wondering if, especially if like this housing, I think I heard you say that the YGB bill doesn't have like affordability requirements for the housing that would be built there. So is there much concern or conversation about that actually like contributing to schools closing in sort of a roundabout way? Do you know what I'm asking?
Yeah, I think so. Our hope, and the districts that have done this work have actually been able to set up all of their developments so that they're making money off of the land or off of the housing developments. And at least of the examples I know of, none of them have used any school district funding to actually develop the land. They've used other processes, which I won't like dig too deeply into because it gets complicated very quickly. So I think my answer to your question is no, the districts won't like take school money and then just use that to develop housing. It is that the housing should be able to finance itself and make sure that those remain separate, and hopefully in an ideal world actually increase the amount of money that the school district has.
Great, thank you. Shirley White, you've had your hand raised for a while.
Actually, yeah, this is Ken Orgoglioso, actually. I do have a question on this legislation pertaining to schools that would possibly build rental housing on their district property for school teachers. And I'm wondering if in the legislation they would be restricted where they could not declare a rent for the property and then also declare that as part of the teacher's salary and deduct that from it, which I've seen happen in the past in other organizations.
There's not currently a restriction there. So we could have a conversation about potentially adding it. I think, teacher recruitment is really, really difficult right now. So I would hope that this would be a strategy for bringing in teachers, like creating, something that's a more generous opportunity that the potential like union contracts and set salaries don't actually allow for. But it's a good flag. So I'll take it back to our team.
Okay.
Okay, it looks like Aubrey answered the chat. So, Joe, you're going to be our last question of the evening. But you're muted.
Right. I was just going to ask if Zach was aware of the little brouhaha that happened in Castle Rock in Douglas County when the church tried to allow homeless to park their vans on their property. And if this influenced this bill at all.
I am aware of it, and I can't speak necessarily to if that was a direct thing that caused us to run this bill or not, but definitely aware of the circumstances that you're talking about.
That's what's it.
All right. We're getting pretty close to time here, so I'm going to thank all the panelists very much for being here. Yay. We really appreciate your time and interesting discussions, and thank you to all the attendees, and I'll turn it over to Trish to close us out.
Yes, wow, thank you so much to all of our panelists. It's going to give us a lot to be able to be on the watch for and follow come January. I just want to let everybody know that the recording for this session will be available on the Housing Task Force page at our league website. Give it a couple of days, but it will be up there quickly, so it'll be available for others to watch. And also I'd recommend you keep an eye on our league calendar and the Housing Task Force webpage for future meetings that would be coming up, and an update on the work of the Legislative Action Committee that will be going on starting in January. So otherwise, I just want to wish everybody a happy holiday. And again, thank you so much for coming.